Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bloodworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is a continuation. This is part 4 of my MYFAROG 4.0 series, and today we're going to focus on the combat system. So, before I actually jump into the pages of the rule book and go over that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the MYFAROG website where you can look at the actual errata, the frequently asked questions and the description and explanation in some cases of why these combat system changes were made. So we will switch views and here we go. So MYFAROG.org and major overhaul and upgrade of MYFAROG. So 3.3 is the newest version of the game, although I keep on referring to 4.0. 4.0 is just the cover change and some of the corrections were made as well between 3.3 and 4.0 as far as spelling or formatting issues. But the content itself, the game rules itself are the same whether you have 3.3 or 4.0. So we're going to jump right to the combat. And these are the combat changes. So AV stands for armor value. And the way armor value worked was that it absorbed damage after the damage die was rolled. So after an effective hit on the character, and then the opponent would roll their damage roll. Let's say they rolled a d6, and let's say that they had a quality hit that was going to do an additional 2 points of damage. So they roll a d6 and they roll a 3, and then they have the 2 additional damage, so that's a 5. But the individual they were hitting was wearing armor, and so their armor would give them an absorption rate of, let's say, 2. And so what would have been 5 points of damage dealt was now only 3 points of damage felt on the victim of the attack. So, and this had started to become an issue later on in a character's development, whether it be from them having better, more expensive, or higher quality armor, or skills were giving them that difficulty to be hit in the first place. And so the rationale for changing this and removing the armor value's absorption rate and just making the armor value, changing how difficult it was to hit your person, so hit the body of the person. So let's say we keep that same armor value of a +2 armor. Well, instead of it absorbing 2 points of damage, what it made was that it became 2 pips harder to hit you when you're making your attack roll. So conceptually, I want you to think of it this way. So if I missed you by those 2 points, you can explain to the player that was being hit that yes, physical contact was made, but their armor absorbed 100% of the damage. All right. If, on the other hand, the attacker rolled beyond that and actually hit the player's person, then you would describe that to the victim of the attack. Well, they bypassed your armor in some way, and you received the full 6 points of damage. So with the other system, the player was kind of getting a second layer of protection, of having that absorption rate, and it just changed the dynamic of the combat, where it could become nearly impossible to actually hit somebody or do any kind of real damage to them, because of their skill level was so high and their equipment quality was so high as well. So that's one of the major changes that was implemented. 3d6 to resolve all skill checks, including combat, was removed. So now you're rolling a d20 in order to hit. And I'm no mathematician, but it does change the it changes the bell curve, and it allows for more moderate hits and fewer critical misses and fewer critical hits as well. So toughness is another thing that and this is mostly creatures. Creatures would have a toughness, so like a thickness of their hide that would absorb damage very much like armor was doing. But toughness could actually also apply to human characters who trained in that toughness, and they would have a natural toughness. This was rolled into just simply a resistance. So you would have a resistance to various types of, heat, cold, electrical, or, fire and such. And also in, the physical attacks part was not conveyed through this system, combined up into one stat. Excuse me. Variable chances of critical failure was, going back to that. Well, it's just a 5% chance now with a natural roll of a 1, or a natural roll of a 20 is obviously a critical success. A lot of major change, a lot of minor changes with AV gone and cut and shock tables needed minor changes. Morale is now affecting you in the periods of minutes instead of rounds. Shields are simplified. Armor is simplified. Wrestling is changed. Size now matters in wrestling. Combat modifications changed for attacking multiple times. So the maximum number is 3 attacks per round, regardless of how much you were willing to spend in stamina cost. A cover system, so hiding behind, or partially behind objects, has been added to factor in for missile DV, which stands for defensive value. Rules for helpless and surprise targets changed. Size matters more for missile defensive value as well. Basically, the bigger you are, the harder you are to hit with missile weapons. The smaller you are, the easier you are, sorry. The bigger you are, the easier you are to hit with missile weapons. Skill system going to the D20 instead of the 3D6 changes the bell curve. An encumbrance system has been implemented a little bit more so than it was in the past. Armor other than light starts to deplete your stamina points, 1 point per hour for medium armor, and 2 points per hour for heavy armor. Once again, light. Now, if you're wearing elvish quality armor or dwarvish quality armor, obviously those adjustments are alleviated. Wearing anything more than light armor will give you a negative movement score modification. Shields have been simplified, and also they give you now a varied protection. So small, medium, or large, as simple as the DV +1, +2 versus missiles for small, +2 against melee attacks, +3 versus missiles for medium, and +2 attack and +4 missile attack defense for large shields. Otherwise, they act as they did before. Small shields can be used with a sling, and you can carry more javelins and such with a smaller shield in one hand and your javelins in the other. You can actually hold some of your javelins in your shield hand. So large shields cannot be on horseback, obviously. So those are the major changes in the those are the major changes, kind of a brief overview of them. Now I'm going to actually talk about the combat system itself and explain that somewhat. So here we go. So I'm in the process. I made copies of it out as much as I could, and really flattened out that binding and everything. What I will be doing, and I'm going to talk about this little project at the end, I will be taking a lot of these and putting them together in a much more easily displayed version of this. So the combat mechanics, your offensive value is your ability, obviously, to attack, and OV, and then it would be listed as OVME, means offensive value melee. You take your melee skill proficiency. You may have a +1. You may have a +1 due to your strength bonus or a skill that incorporates that. You have an encumbrance modifier. If you're carrying a medium or heavy load, that may, impact your ability in melee combat. A condition modifier. If you're fatigued, that may also prevent that. A weapon modifier. So you might have a weapon that is perhaps a high quality weapon, and so you'll get a bonus for using a high quality weapon, or you may have a really crappy weapon and it will give a minus. All right, plus other melee mods from various combat situations. So what that'll do is that will give you a plus or a minus, and when you roll your d20, you're going to say, all right, I rolled the 13. My target has a defensive value for melee of 11. So if I rolled the 13, I hit my target fairly well. Probably not enough to give it a plus, but certainly enough to deal full damage when I roll my damage die. Your offensive value for missiles is pretty much the same thing, right? You get a plus for your missile skill. You have an encumbrance modifier. You have a condition modifier. If you're wearing it, you're going to have a modifier for missile weapons to make it a little bit harder if you're wearing a helmet. Your weapon modifier, quality, once again, and then other missile mods that may take place. Your defensive value for melee is +10. So everybody has a minimum of a 10. In other words, their attacker must roll a 10 just to barely hit you, or higher to hit you with full effect or greater effect. Your armor and helmet defensive value, if any, is going to increase that target number of a 10. So if I'm wearing armor that is a +1 AV and a helmet that gives me a +1 AV, my overall is a +2. So now it takes a 12 just to barely hit me and a 13 to hit me for full damage. A shield modifier if you're using a shield. Again, we spoke about shield modifiers a little bit earlier. Your defensive for missile only. All right, and let's see if I can actually get that here. Let's do this, sorry. So your defensive value is size divided by 2. All right, so if your size is a 2, your defensive value is going to be a 1, which means it's only a +1. And size of 2 is really quite large. Plus other missile modifiers. All right, so your defensive value, the larger you are, the easier it is to hit you. So if you are a size 2, the person attacking you is still going to have a +1 to hit you. Defensive value for melee Encumbrance modifier, again, if you're wearing medium or heavy armor, all right, it is going to affect your ability to defend against a melee attack. Your condition modifier, whether you're tired or injured or soaking wet, also causes you to be less maneuverable. +1 if you're carrying more than one weapon in each hand, or one weapon in each hand. So you will get an increased defensive value. All right, if you're carrying two weapons, a +1 to the weapon mods based on if there were any positives based on your weapon's quality, other melee mods, and melee skill proficiency divided by 3 rounded down. All right, that's a big change from before because your skill proficiencies were accumulating like super large bonuses to your attacks. And so, I mean, to you being able to be hit. So it converts that, so your attack ability wasn't only increasing with your attack ability, it was also increasing your defenses. So it kind of reflects you deflecting with your weapon skill incoming attacks. All right, so what this does is you only get to translate 1/3 of your weapon bonuses to apply to your defensive value versus melee combat. So it makes you a little bit easier to hit than in the previous 2.7 and earlier versions of this game. So that was a much needed change because once you have a defensive value of 20 or above, even a natural 20 only does half damage. And then if you are wearing armor with its ability to absorb damage, you were virtually untouchable until you became so fatigued that you just wouldn't be able to continue fighting. But it was kind of an all or nothing kind of a system. It wasn't working well. Dodging proficiency of the target is added to the defensive value, but only if the target is aware of the shooter or thrower and is in a position where he or she is able to perform evasive maneuvers. So dodging still only applies to, it applies to attacks that you can see coming at you. All right. If you were actively dodging a melee attack, all right, then you are using one of your actions, let's say, to actively dodge. Missile dodging is a little bit different, where you're able to dodge it, but still you're not expending your action as long as you are aware of the attack. Weapon damage, as I mentioned earlier, weapon damage is based on the base of the weapon type plus the quality of your hit. Now, the quality of your hit is determined by a number of successful points above your target range. And I will go into that resolution chart and explain that to you a little bit more. There is also added of cuts and shock when your character is hit, and the greater your size, the harder it is in some cases to shock you or to put your body into shock, but it has less effect on cuts, so you're still able to bleed, but harder to shock you when you're very large. So the combat resolution. There is lowered guard, so there are various stances that you can use in combat that are part of the charges in combat modifications under formations and such. I'll wait for this to try to focus in a little better. There we go. Combat resolution, as I said, so defensive value. All right, so if you are below the defensive value, so again, like I said, if somebody has a 10 defensive value and I roll a 9 or less, I do no damage. If I roll equal to that defensive value, I only do half damage. If I roll a 1 or 2 above that defensive value, I do normal damage. 3 to 4 plus 1, and so on to the maximum. If I roll a 10 or more above the defensive value, I am going to get regular damage plus 10 damage. All right, which is a huge amount of damage in this game. If I roll a natural 20, at worst, I'm going to do some damage. All right, regular damage. I'm not going to only do half damage if I roll a maximum 20. That is also a change from the previous editions of this game. All right, a 19, the worst I can do is half damage. A 1 is a fumble, and when you look at the fumbling, a 2, a natural 2 is automatic no damage. So it doesn't matter what their condition was that made their defensive value a 2. If I rolled a 2, I'm not going to do any damage regardless, even though I did minimally hit them. So cut effects. So now we're using the D20 now in order to determine your cut effects. And you would take the modifier from the weapon. All right, so weapons have modifiers for cuts and they have modifiers for shock. And you use the modifier to apply to your ability to cut. You're also going to include the size of the opponent, all right, or the or other factors that will modify this as well. So size plays a role, especially in shock. Size plays a role. And let me just read this to you. If you roll an 8 or lower on this 3d6 roll plus mods, I'm sorry, this is where the 3d6 is still used. You're rolling 3d6 plus the mods. If you roll below a -1, because the modifiers took 3 and let's say there was a -4 to that, cast a d12, instant death if the result is greater than the target size. Otherwise, it's a serious bleeding. All right, so you can one-shot in this game if you're extremely lucky. But if it's a very large creature, you're going to have a harder time one-shotting it. If it's a much smaller creature, then there's more of a chance because their size does affect this. They have a size modifier. And the same thing with shock. So these can cause instant death or very serious bleeding. This here can cause instant death on the same chance. However, it's more knockdowns and limiting of movement abilities and skill abilities because you are stunned or knocked down or just left wobbly on your feet. So here we have a size chart, basically, and you can see, what constitutes very small. If you go to medium, medium's going to have a +0 modifier. Very tiny is going to have a -10, and very, very large, above 1,401 pounds, is going to be a +10 that you would apply. So if you applied a +10 to that instant death possibility, number one, it's going to be hard even to get a -1 on that. And then secondly, you're going to have to compare that to their size. And so on a D12, you're going to have to roll above a 10. All right, so an 11 or a 12 in order to get that instant kill. So it's very, very difficult to do that. Health points is in this section. They just talk about per level, how many health points. characters get. We're not going to focus on that here. There's resistance and damage, and we talked a little bit about resistance. And your resistance are cold, disease, electric, heat, physical, and poison. All right, so if your character has a +2 resistance to physical damage, that means that you will get those -2 to attack rolls against your character because your character is naturally tough. The combat round is laid out here, and the combat round talks about the first thing is that you check morale. Now, I personally don't check morale at the beginning of a round unless the players are encountering some kind of a never seen before creature or just something that is so shocking or terrifying that that they'd have to test. But if they're facing just regular human beings, then they're adventurers for the most part. They've probably had some training, and they're probably prepared for this. When I do a check for morale, is if the combat starts to go against them. And the same thing holds true for their NPC opponents. I don't typically do a morale check unless the character group's perceived strength is much higher than the group that they're attacking. So let's say they're a group of 5 adventurers and they're attacking even 10 civilians. The civilians are going to have to make a morale check because they realize the power differential between an adventuring party and just, Joe Farmer, in the field with a bunch of his civilian companions, around him. So I usually do that. Players will declare their actions. Check for falling if they're making a movement and you want to do this. This is an optional rule. Riders test their riding if you're charging into combat on horseback. You check for random movement. Again, another option here. You check for initiative. So initiative uses D6 plus a dexterity bonus plus a mod for talent. If, let's say, you have good reflexes and or you're aggressive, you would have a plus for those talents. +4 if you're using a missile weapon. If a character uses a missile weapon, has initiative, his attack will be resolved before taking into consideration the initiative modifications for melee. So even if a melee attacker has a higher initiative than a missile attacker, the missile attacker will still go first. Initiative modifications only for melee is positive for size. So so the size that you are, the smaller you are, the faster you are, basically. +2 if using a long-reaching weapon. +4 if using a long-reaching melee weapon. +4 using a very long reaching, like a pike or a spear or such. +6 if using extremely long, a pike in this case. All right. Character formations, I'm not going to get too much involved with that at this point, but I don't think there's as much a rule change with character formations than there was previously, other than some of the modifiers that come into play. Pretty much the only characters that actually march in formations is warriors and dwarves. Also have an advantage in acting in formations. At least that was the old rules that also probably carried over to. There's a lot of optional rules in this. All right, so you can either simplify your combat system, or you could add in all of these optional rules for something that is very, very complex. I would severely limit the number of options that you are going to include if you're dealing with a full party of characters where they're facing a lot of NPCs, because it will become a record-keeping nightmare for you. But if you're playing like a DM +1, where you're just you and a single player, and you wanted to get into the deep nuances of a combat system, then by all means, I would include probably more, if not all, of the optional systems that are here. So fumbling, and they give you the consequences and such for fumbling. And that's fumbling for missile weapons, fumbling for slings in particular, fumbling for melee weapons, and then for natural attacks as well. And they give you the consequences. We'll let this catch up, if it may. There we go. So there are various modifications to your morale. Most of them are talent-based. So courageous is a talent, gives you a +2. Fearless is a talent, gives you a +2. The formation mod, so marching in a formation, will give you a +2 for morale. If you're a dwarf, level 4 dwarf, elf, halfling, or warrior advantage gives an additional +1. A level 8 of those same get an additional +1 on top of the previous pluses. Animal friend talent only in relation to animals, +2. The strength mod for dwarfs and warrior inspiration. All right, so dwarves and warriors add their strength modification to their morale. A +2 for a male family tribe member is fighting on your side. A +4 if a female family member, tribe member, is fighting on your side, or a female or child member of your family tribe is at risk of suffering harm if you lose the fight. So you will get advantages if you are, defending someone on your side. So for the sake of defending somebody, you'll get an additional morale boost for that. The results of either maintaining your morale or failing your morale. So once again, you're going to roll the 3d6 and then apply all of your possible modifiers. And for the most part, a 0 or less means that you panic and flee for 2 to 6 rounds. He is, in addition to the traumatized with a -1 modifier to fortitude. All right, so you have panics and flees for 6 rounds, d6 rounds, terrified for d6 minutes, fearful for d6 minutes, all the way up to no consequence. So greater than a 9 on a 3d6 roll plus your modifiers is that you have no consequences for a morale loss. So as I said earlier, I tend not to use morale at the very beginning because I like to cut down on a number of rolls that have to be made. But that's, again, a addition, nervous, fearful, terrified, or panicked. And then these are all negative modifiers to your skills. So if you're terrified, you're going to be a -4 modifier to every single skill that you are using. So it's not great to be terrified in combat. Your combat modifications, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is if you're carrying a heavy load, your offensive value melee is at a -3. Your offensive value missile is at a -3. your defensive value melee is at a -3, and your defensive value missile is a 0. So the amount of load that you're carrying has no impact on your defensive value for missile weapons. Going on, this is kind of a weird one. I know, perhaps Varg doesn't like fighting in the rain. All right, but soaking wet, you get all kinds of modifiers to to your combat, -1s to your combat abilities and defensive abilities, mostly in melee combat. So again, very interesting that that's in there. Spell casting and such, so drawing a weapon, all of these may have modifiers to your ability to to do that next attack. And so it's harder if you're drawing so to draw a weapon from a belt or a scabbard, you're at a -3 for the attack. You're a -3 for your offensive missile value. So if you're drawing your bow from around your back and you weren't ready for combat yet, you're going to get a -3. Your defensive value, you're easier to hit if you're in mid movement to draw your weapon. And once again, your defensive value versus missiles is unchanged. You could be doing that, I'm assuming, and still dodge a missile that you see being prepared to fire at you. Missile attack effects are down here. Same system, basically. Carrying out a missile attack in melee is a -2 to your offensive value missile, -4 to your defensive value melee. So that means that if you're in very close quarters and you're still trying to fire off your arrow, bow and arrow, let's say, your offensive value is going to be harder, and your defensive value it's going to be easier to hit you with a melee weapon if you are, trying to do that Legolas thing and firing off missiles in very close proximity. Attacking twice in one round will give you an offensive value melee of -3. So your first attack is going to be normal, but your second attack will be at a -3. Your offensive value missile will be at a -3. So if you're firing that second arrow, your defensive value, so it'll be easier to hit you by -3. Attacking 3 times in one round, -6. All right, for your subsequent attacks, -6 for your subsequent attacks if missile weapon, -6 to defend yourself against melee attacks when you're doing, when you're making that many number of attacks. That's certainly going to dissuade anyone doing multiple attacks like that in a big, scrum, a big, fray of others attacking you at the same time. I seriously probably wouldn't do a third attack with that amount of disadvantages for it. So other stances of movement, we go into various others where if you're jogging, flying, levitating, prone, riding, running, and so on. So there's a lot of modifications that take place. Illumination modifications to your attacks and defensive value as well. Random movement direction, so that gets into more movement. Disarming is an optional rule, and then disarming can still cause some possible damage. I'll wait for this to catch up. It's kind of blurry. And sometimes it doesn't catch up. Yeah, that's weird. There we go. Sorry about that. So here, even when you're trying to disarm, you still have a chance of doing some damage. Random item damage, so your items can be damaged as well. Again, another optional rule. Possible consequences of that, you're rolling a d20. And virtually everything that you're carrying could potentially be damaged. Armor, so we're going into the armor section now. So here we go. Let's spend a little bit of time with armor now. So here are all your light armors, and you'll see your light armors generally do not have a modifier to your movement skill. All right, unless you get to boiled leather and dragon scale. Right, so regular fur shirt, which is a very common shirt for virtually everybody to be wearing, is going to give you a +1 to your defensive value. All right, so that automatically makes you just a little bit harder for the hit to get through and damage your body. All right, so that's how you have to keep on thinking about what armor actually does for you. It's going to make you harder to hit your body. All right, so if they miss by just 1 point and you're wearing a fur shirt, you can describe this to the character that yes, they got hit, but the damage did not penetrate their fur shirt. So no modifier when you get down here. So let's look at scale. Scale is a medium armor. It's a +3 defensive value. Dodging, your maximum is a +2, so it's harder to dodge in that, and your movement skills are going to be at a -3 while wearing it. You are also going to expend traveling 1 SP per hour wearing that armor. And then heavy armor, you can see, goes to +2 per hour. Now, on average, I was seeing that, a human warrior, and even if they do become very skilled with stamina traits, that they're going to, or talents, I should say, they're going to wear down pretty fast in movement wearing that heavy armor. That will be checked every hour. So if they're traveling for, I think it's about 5 hours. If they're traveling for 5 hours wearing a heavy suit of armor, the average person with a 10 stamina is going to be fatigued at that point. Another 5 hours will take them to a -10, and now they're going to move from being, slightly fatigued to the next level of minuses. The next level of minuses included in that. Here you have all your melee weapons, and we'll just focus on the top here so I don't have to mess around with the sheet. But let's say a battle axe, a long two-handed weapon, does a d12 +1. All right, that +1 means that you need a strength modifier of a +1 just to utilize this weapon. It has no modifier to cuts or shock. It's a long shafted war axe. That's a description. All right, so it does count as a long weapon, and so it will give you an initiative modifier for that weapon. If we go to, let's say, a pike here, let's find a pike. So spears, so here we have a pike down over here, two-handed once again. These little footnotes are 13, that's going to tell you that it's a very long reaching weapon. It does D10. You can handle a pike if you have a -1 to your strength mod. All right, so you don't have to be very strong to use a pike. A pike is going to subtract 1 from your cuts, so it's easier to cut you with a pike, and a +1 harder to put you into shock with a pike. Only weighs 4 pounds, and so on. So that's your melee weapons. And there's a long list of melee weapons, as you can see here. You have unarmed down at the bottom, natural weapons down at the bottom, battle gloves and such, and swords and such. So here are all those specific modifiers that are applied to those initiative modifiers down over here, which I mentioned earlier. You have item quality. All right, so a recalcum will do a damage +1, the real value for the, and so on. So any of these superior material weapons are going to give pluses based on the quality or the material of those weapons. Obviously, halflings, dwarves, and gnomes and have certain various weapon restrictions, such as they're limited in two-handed weapons. Other than dwarves, dwarves can use two-handed weapons, but halflings and gnomes are limited from using two-handed weapons. They go into shields here, and once again, the variable shield ability, it's a +2 overall for DV. All right, a +4 DVMI for a large shield. So it's harder to hit you with a large shield if you are attacked with missile weapons. Shield blocking +8 to defensive value missile. So if you're specifically holding up your shield to block missile weapons coming in, it is 8 points harder in order to hit you for that arrow to get through and actually do bodily damage. Your movement modifier, so all your movement skills are lessened by 3 points. So when you're rolling a d20, you're going to have a -3 if you're carrying a large shield, if you're trying to climb or do anything that is a movement-based skill. We have missile weapons, and once again, composite bow. Let's see, composite bow is going to do D6 plus your strength modifier. Right, this is a bow that is crafted to take advantage of your strength, and so you're going to do more damage with this bow. Here you have a crossbow, which not only gives you a +1 to your offensive value to begin with, but it's going to be a D6 +1 plus your strength modifier. All right. Concussion weapons thrown. So these are if you're throwing your weapons and how they might affect that. And there's an optional rule for throwing axes a bit later on. Then you have your slings and such, and then your javelins, your throwing spears, whether it be short-winged, and so on. So this is if you're taking those melee weapons and throwing them instead. All right, we have different, different materials for your arrowheads and their impact or effect as well, plus range modifiers and how far you're firing from and what the effect is on your base ranges and such. Here's that throwing axe optional rule. Now, I didn't actually go right into the, into like wrestling because I know it was mentioned specifically because that's a very specific skill. Let me switch views back here. But you can see that there's a lot here. I mean, you have to remember that MYFAROG is based on the Rollmaster system, or the Horn system and such. So it's much more crunchy than a D&D based system. Even though Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had some influence on this game, I think there's much more Rollmaster here than that, or MERPS, if you want to say that, which is basically the Rollmaster system anyway. There's a lot of crunch here if you choose to include it. And this is the streamlined version, so you can imagine how this has really improved upon that. So I did mention that I will be working on a project of creating a MythMasters screen, which is basically a DM screen for this game system, where it's just going to take the charts and I'm going to put them in the order of following the combat round. All right, so even though this was like the fourth page in this really should be first page information. So what I'm going to do is I will cut and paste these various charts and everything. Maybe not all the footnotes. It's not to replace the core rule book, but what it is meant to do is to create a quick reference chart to go through and manage combat. All right, so you'll have right in front of you on the first panel the combat round sequence, and then it will begin with morale and initiative. That will most likely be the very first panel of the MythMasters screen, and then the second panel will be combat resolution, damage resolution, some of your other modifiers to that. So it will go through the sequence in that order and present to you primarily just the charts themselves. That way you can use this as a tool to actually manage combat a lot simpler than flipping through pages and not bog you down with information that you don't necessarily need in the heat of battle, but you might want to reference, so such as like the weapon stats and such would be the last couple of panels of this of this project that I'm putting together. This project will be freely made available, so I'm going to put it together, form it up into format it as a PDF, and make this PDF available to anyone who wants to use it for free. And so that will be out there, and I'm hoping to have that done in in a week or so. It's a bit of a cut and paste and scan and kind of project to deal with. I also, for other MYFAROG news, I also have another adventure that that I'm waiting for approval for it to go up onto DriveThruRPG, and so that adventure I'm hoping by early next week, possibly by Monday, as long as there's no hangups with it, should be available on DriveThruRPG. That's going to be a 17-page adventure, so a little bit longer than my 6-page one that's already up there on the RSL Games publishing site on DriveThruRPG. So you could always look that up there, and I have a link in the description of this video where you can go directly there and see some of the other projects that I have there. And I will continue just producing these videos for this game system, which is one that I certainly enjoy, and I know a lot of you out there really enjoy this as well, because the viewership of these videos is really quite high, and I'm really appreciative of all of the fans of this game system coming to this channel and supporting this channel, and all of the projects that are coming up and around this game system, whether you're whether you're going to Amazon and picking up these projects, or you're going to Drive Through RPG and picking these up, or you're just going to the Facebook page and participating and getting involved with events and games and such that are taking place. So once again, thank you for joining the channel. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hadn't subscribed, please consider subscribing. Share this video out with your friends. And if you haven't picked this up, $10 on Amazon. If you're in Europe, I know it's a little bit harder to find, shipping and handling that's reasonable. But do your best out there. I know that there's an Amazon Germany and an Amazon UK that you might be able to get copies of this for, with a somewhat reasonable shipping involved. But it really is a huge improvement from MYFAROG 3.0 and a lot of major tweaks from 2.7 and earlier as well. So it's a great system, and for $10 you really can't go wrong. So once again, thanks for joining. You have a great upcoming week, and remember to be safe out there, and I look forward to seeing you on a gaming screen sometime soon. You'll have a great afternoon.